Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for turning out again. I hope that extra hour of sleep was worthwhile, either for sleep or for a later night last night. A couple of housekeeping notes before we begin this morning's program. We're going to anchor around 1:30, and from the anchoring, we're going to take tenders in. The military will all be on basically a ferry. It's a huge tender. We need the military folks to assemble in here at 1:15. Originally, it was going to be 1 p.m., but we don't need to hold you down here for a full 15 extra minutes. So 1:15 back here. The cultural folks that are going to be going off on St. Peter Port tour, please meet in the main bar, just right on the 5th floor down here, at 1:45. So 1:15 and 1:45. A couple of reminders: you need to bring your boarding card, the little leather with your silver card in there. I would recommend you bring your map guide that was delivered 2 nights ago, I believe, in your room. This will give you an idea of what Guernsey is and where you are on Guernsey so that the guides can reference it during the touring. The temperature is going to be about a pretty constant 56, overcast, a slight wind, not much of a chance for rain, but those red jackets would be very helpful if it does rain or if it is windy. Sunscreen, hat, all the usual. And I think that's it. So 1:15 for the military here in the show lounge, 1:45 for the cultural right over there in the main bar. Thank you.
Well, ready for another great day. And everybody geared up and ready to go, locked and loaded. So Rick Atkinson's here with us again today to tell us about the build-up for the opening of the second front and the long-awaited cross-channel attack. And he's going to talk about Allied planning and the planner, who worked on what is now known and has been known ever since as Operation Overlord, the large D-Day invasion that we talked about some already in the last few days. His latest book in his trilogy, Guns at Last Light, although regrettably not available for sale here on the ship, along with any of the other books everybody's asking me about. But you can go online and order them from our store, and they'll be home when you get there. So, but it's a great, great book. I encourage all of you to read it if you have not. So he's going to shed some more light on Guns at Last Light. Rick, come on up here. And join me in welcoming. And I hope that one doesn't fall, because it's from glass.
If it does, I go dry. Thanks, Nick.
All right.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Jeremy. And thanks to all of you. I've really enjoyed your company individually and collectively over the last few days, and look forward to chatting a lot more over the remaining week that we've got. Something I should have confessed probably on the first night after we boarded. I don't know about Rob and Don, but when I start going like this as I'm speaking, that means I don't know what I'm talking about. So let's imagine that it's 70 years ago. In fact, 70 years, 2 weeks, and 3 days. It's May 15th, 1944. At St. Paul's School on Hammersmith Road in London, where Dwight Eisenhower, Winston Churchill, Omar Bradley, George Patton, King George VI, and several dozen of the most senior British and American commanders have gathered to review for a last time the plan known as Overlord. It's the plan for the invasion of France, which at that point is scheduled for June 5th, 3 weeks later. And they gather in an auditorium at St. Paul's School. It's not quite as elegant as this one. The generals and admirals are seated on hard wooden benches normally reserved for schoolboys. They're labeled rows B through J. And because German bombs have broken all 700 windows at St. Paul's School, even though it's the middle of May, it's cold as a meat locker in the auditorium. The auditorium's called the Model Room, and the generals and admirals are bundled up in their overcoats. And on the cockpit at the base of this auditorium is a huge plaster of Paris relief map 6 inches to the mile. And it shows that section of the French coast where the River Seine spills into the Atlantic in Normandy. And as they discuss the plan and what is going to happen on the day of the invasion, there's a British brigadier, and he's wearing no skid socks, and he's shuffling around with a pointer as they discuss different geographic locations. The beaches, for example, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. And towns that no one in America has ever heard of before: St. Lo, Caen, Cherbourg, and over on the very edge of the map, Paris. And as they talk about this, the brigadier points to these different places. They talk about their problems. The biggest problem that they have initially is getting across what in the official Army history is called an ugly piece of water called the English Channel. This is the most complex undertaking in the history of warfare. And the channel is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, but for nearly 1,000 years, invading armies going one way or another have found more grief than glory in trying to get across the channel. And one British planner suggested that the only solution was tow over the assault beaches already assaulted. The U.S. War Department, thinking through how do we assault beaches when we know that there are going to be lots of Germans waiting if we come conventionally by sea. And if we come by air, by glider or parachute in airborne operations, we also know that's going to be very hazardous because there are going to be lots of Germans waiting on those landing zones and drop zones. What are the alternatives? So somebody comes up with a bright idea: let's dig a tunnel under the English Channel. And there was a study done. And the officers who did the study reported back to the War Department, yes, sir, we can do this. It'll take 15,000 miners a year to excavate 55,000 tons of spoil, but we can do this. The one thing they could never figure out was what happened when that first miner popped his head out of the hole in Normandy and the entire German 7th Army was waiting for him. So they went back to thinking more conventionally, as they had to. There were so many issues that they were trying to think through and anticipate. They had their own acronym, PINWE, Problems of the Invasion of Northwest Europe. So, for example, among the PINWE issues, there was anxiety that the Germans would fly over England and drop rats infected with bubonic plague. And there were bounties offered on rat carcasses in Britain to test for plague. There was anxiety that the Germans would fly over London and drop what were called radioactive agents, and there were Geiger counters hidden around London to test for radioactivity. The Allies had stocked 160,000 tons of chemical munitions in Britain and in the Mediterranean, lest the war in Normandy turn chemical, as of course it had in World War I. And there were 2 target lists. I found them at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, both of them signed by Eisenhower. 2 target lists for chemical attack by the Allies if the Germans used chemicals first. The first list listed target sites that were based on caring about French civilian casualties. The second target list, not so much. And we would have hit with mustard gas and phosgene and other chemical munitions virtually every road intersection in Normandy. It didn't come to that. The guy who's responsible for all of this is somebody you've perhaps heard of, Dwight David Eisenhower. In the late spring of 1944, he's 53 years old. He's smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day. His blood pressure is 176/110. He's substantially hypertensive. He's got persistent headaches. He's got ringing in one ear. He's a very robust man, but he's under tremendous stress. He's a 4-star general at the time of Normandy, and he's in the process of ascending from lieutenant colonel to 5-star general in 42 months. It's an average of 6 months between promotions. President Roosevelt has selected him as his supreme commander and commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force because he is, as the president says, I alluded to this a couple days ago, a natural leader with exceptional political instincts. He had a knack for getting along with the British, notwithstanding the Anglophobia that ran through the American general officer ranks. I alluded to that also. And he's also been chosen because he has exceptional organizational gifts. He's extremely articulate. He speaks and writes with great precision. Unlike our notion of him as president, where we think of him as kind of a George Bush forerunner, troubled with syntax. In fact, he's very, very precise. Churchill, who knows something about articulation, at one point says to a British general, "I'm not sure I trust a general who's that glib." And as I mentioned, he describes himself as chairman of the board. That's the metaphor he uses. He sees it in corporate terms, chairman of the largest martial enterprise in the Western world. Well, by the late spring of 1944, American soldiers by the tens of thousands are pouring into Britain every week. Since January, the number of GIs in Britain has doubled to 1.5 million. It's a country the size of Oregon. Of the U.S. Army's 89 divisions, a division has about 15,000 soldiers. 20 of them can now be found in Britain, and there's 38 more that are either en route or have been earmarked for the European theater. They come through Liverpool, through Swansea, Cardiff, Belfast, Newport, but most of them come through Glasgow and the Jason Greenock. More than 100,000 in April alone. And they're arriving, in some cases, 15,000 at a time aboard the two Queens, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth. These ships can carry 15,000 soldiers. It's not as comfortable as the Silver Cloud, but the Queens are very fast, and they can outrun German U-boats, they can outrun German torpedoes. And this is the reason the Queens are used to transport eventually hundreds of thousands of soldiers from America to Britain and the continent. Well, we can see them, can't we? Down the gangplanks they tromp. Their names are checked from a clipboard. Each soldier is wearing his helmet, his field jacket, and a large celluloid button color-coded by the section of the ship to which he has been confined during the passage. Troops carry 4 blankets apiece to save cargo space. Deluded officers can be seen lugging folding chairs, pillowcases, tennis rackets. A brass band and Highland pipers greet them on the docks. Scottish school children are there on the docks, giving the V sign, V for victory, as they're arriving. Combat pilots who had fulfilled their mission quotas and are waiting on the docks to board the ship to go home are yelling out at them, "Go back before it's too late," or "What's your wife's telephone number?" Each arriving unit is listed in a master log called the Iron Book, and another manifest called the Forecast of Destination shows where every company would bivouac. An infantry company, maybe 170 men. It's company by company and where they're going to bivouac around the British Isles. And then they fall in 4 abreast and they march across the dock to nearby troop trains, and they're going to be hauled to 1,200 camps and several hundred airfields across Britain. One overeducated lieutenant wrote to his mother, "This country constantly reminds one of Thomas Hardy." But nowhere in Tess of the D'Urbervilles do you find 400,000 prefabricated huts, 279,000 tents, all erected to accommodate this Yankee horde. And they supplement 112,000 buildings borrowed from the British, 20 million square feet of storage, warehouse space. GIs call this new world that they're entering spam land. The prevailing odor, however, is not span, it's burning feces from U.S. Army School of Hygiene coal-fired incinerators. Despite improving logistics, and we're getting better at it as the war goes on, confusion and error abound. The American juggernaut included millions of tons of materiel, and most of it is carried across the Atlantic in cargo ships that arrive days, if not months, after these troops arrive on the fast Queens and other fast troop carriers. So truck drivers are separated from their trucks, drummers are separated from their drums, chaplains are separated from their chalices. In May 1944, the British Ministry of Transport, which is trying to coordinate all of this, allocates 120 berths, shipping berths, for U.S. Army troop ships. But 158 arrived. So negotiations got as far up as Whitehall and the White House over what to do with these 38 orphan vessels. And despite efforts to accommodate them, half the cargo from these 38 ships is just dumped on the ground outside various ports. It includes 5,000 tons of peanuts, 50,000 portable radios, and it's subsequently all lost to exposure to the weather. This is quite common. GIs claim, yes, the Army is cutting red tape lengthwise. Well, the loading of vessels bound for the far shore, that's what they call Normandy, the far shore. The troops don't know where they're going. Very few know where they're going. But they know they're going somewhere. They know it's somewhere across the water, and they call it generically the far shore. So the loading of invasion vessels had begun on May 4th, 1944. And as the month wore away, it really intensified. 7,000 kinds of combat necessities are going to be needed on the beaches in the first 4 hours. That's from surgical scissors to bazooka rockets. And then thousands of tons are going to be needed in the subsequent days. Responsibility for embarkation fell to 3 military bureaucracies with acronyms evocative of the Marx Brothers: MOVCO, Turco, and Embarco. Merchant marine captains were sequestered in a London basement near Selfridge's department store, and there they prepared loading plans using the blueprints of deck and cargo spaces spread on huge tables, and wooden blocks scaled to every jeep, howitzer, and shipping container are pushed around like chess pieces on these blueprints to ensure that they fit. And in the camps, soldiers lay out full-size deck replicas on the ground, and they practice wheeling trucks and guns in and out. A great deal had been learned from earlier invasions in North Africa, Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and of course the Pacific. A vast flotilla of amphibious vessels had been designed and built by the thousands in the previous 2 years. Nick last night talked about the Higgins boat. No less critical was a much larger vessel, the LST, Landing Ship Tank. It had clamshell bow doors. and a bow ramp. It could carry 20 Sherman tanks and a lot of other stuff, and it could put them right on the beach. More than 1,000 LSTs were built during the war. Shipping is the narrow bottleneck through which all critical decision-making, strategic decision-making, must pass during World War II. And nowhere is it more critical than for Normandy. The invasion has been delayed a month, from early May to early June, in order to allow more LSTs to show up and other kinds of landing craft. In 22 British ports, stevedores slung pallets and cargo nets into the holds and onto decks as this loading goes on. Radios from Pennsylvania, grease from Texas, rifles from Massachusetts. For Overlord, the U.S. Army had accumulated in Britain 300,000 vehicles, 1,800 train locomotives, 20,000 rail cars, 2.6 million small arms, 2,700 artillery pieces, 300,000 telephone poles, and 7 million tons of gasoline, oil, and other petroleum products. SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, it's Eisenhower's headquarters. SHAEF had calculated daily combat consumption from fuel to bullets to chewing gum at 41.298 pounds per soldier moved onto the far shore. Every soldier you put into France requires 41.298 pounds of stuff to support him. 60 million K rations, it's enough to feed the invasion force for a month, have been bundled into 500-ton bales. And huge army rail cars, known as war flats, are used to take tanks and bulldozers to the ports. Mountains of ammunition are stacked on car ferries that had been requisitioned from Boston, New York, and Baltimore. Armed guards from 10 cartography depots escorted 3,000 tons of maps for D-Day alone. They're the first of 210 million maps that will be distributed in Europe during the war. Most of them are printed in 5-color. Also into the holds, as this loading goes on in May 1944, 280,000 hydrographic charts. So you can read the bottom of the ocean if you're a Coast Guardsman or Navy skipper. And they're town plats for the likes of Cherbourg and St. Lo. Many of the 1 million aerial photos, reconnaissance photos, of German defenses that had been snapped by reconnaissance planes along the beaches, they also go into the holds. The U.S. First Army, it's the largest tactical unit for the Americans going to land on June 6, commanded by Omar Bradley. The U.S. First Army battle plan for Overlord contains more words than Gone with the Wind. I can hear Professor Miller somewhere in the peanut gallery saying, yeah, but not more than the Liberation Trilogy. The 1st Infantry Division alone, and we'll run into them a lot, they're going to land on Omaha Beach. Field Order Number 35, which is their plan, has 15 annexes and 18 appendices, including a reminder to drive on the right side of the road. Again, we can see it, can't we? This day after day, war material cascading onto the wharves and the quays. Radio crystals by the thousands, carrier pigeons by the hundreds. Each American general is authorized to take with him 100 silver stars and 300 Purple Hearts, better known to soldiers as the German Marksmanship Medal. They're also carrying 10,000 Hagginson packs. These are canvas bags that have been sewn by sailmakers in lofts across England, and they've been stuffed with plastic explosive to blow up the beach defenses. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the beaches. A company that had been contracted to deliver 10,000 crosses was late on its contract. They missed their deadline, and instead graves registration units would improvise with wooden grave markers. Cotton mattress covers, which were to be used as shrouds, had been purchased on the basis of 1 for every 375 man-hours in France. That formula proved way too optimistic. And in July, with supplies of cotton mattress covers dwindling, quartermasters would be forced to order another 50,000. These are used to wrap the dead. Four hospital ships made ready. The reporter Martha Gellhorn, who was there, described them as snowy white with many bright red crosses painted on the hull and painted flat on the boat deck. Each LST would carry at least 2 physicians and 20 Navy corpsmen to evacuate casualties from France. And operating rooms had been installed on the open tank decks. One officer described them as a cold, dirty trap, which they were. All told, Overlord would muster 8,000 doctors, 600,000 doses of penicillin, 50 tons of sulfa, and 800,000 pints of plasma. By the way, the plasma was meticulously segregated by white and black donors. On Tuesday, May 23rd, 1944, a great migration of assault troops swept from their preliminary camps toward the English seaside and into a dozen marshalling areas. Americans on the southwest coast of England, the Brits and the Canadians in the south. And this is where the final staging begins. And march rates as they're going to these marshalling areas had been calculated so that each convoy was to travel 25 miles in 2 hours, vehicles 60 yards apart, with a 10-minute halt before every even hour on the hour. And military policemen, they're wearing brassards that are specially treated to detect poison gas in case the Germans gas the marshalling areas, are waving traffic through the intersections and thatched roof villages all across southern England. Mothers holding their children aloft from the curb to watch the armies pass. And on tanks and trucks, the men have chalked the names of sweethearts left behind, so nearly every vehicle has, as one captain puts it, a patron girl saint, or perhaps a patron girl sinner. By late in the week, the marshalling camps were sealed. Sentries were ordered to shoot to kill any deserters. And GIs wearing captured German uniforms and captured enemy weapons wander through the bivouacs so troops grew familiar with the enemy's appearance. They would know what the Germans looked like. Fantastic rumors swirled through these final encampments that British commandos in a raid very similar to the failed raid on Saint-Nazaire had in fact captured Cherbourg. This is not true. That Berlin intended to sue for peace. This is not true. That a particular unit would be sacrificed in a diversionary attack. This was not true. That the German Wehrmacht possessed either a death beam capable of incinerating many acres at a time, or they had a vast refrigerating apparatus that could create big icebergs in the English Channel. This was true. This was not true. A column in the military newspaper, Stars and Stripes, advised soldiers, don't be surprised if a Frenchman steps up to you and kisses you. That doesn't mean he's queer. It just means he's emotional. Security remained paramount. SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, had concluded that the invasion had little chance of success if the enemy received even 48 hours advance notice that the invasion was coming, and Schaeff, to use Eisenhower's words, quote, any time longer than 48 hours spells certain defeat. The British government in early April had imposed a ban that kept the usual 600,000 visitors from approaching coastal stretches along the North Sea, the Bristol Channel, and the English Channel. 2,000 Army counterintelligence agents sniffed around for leaks. Censors fluent in 22 languages, including Ukrainian and Slovak, scrutinized soldiers' letters, cutting out indiscretions with X-Acto knives, until May 25th, when all outgoing mail was stopped completely for 10 days. And then camouflage inspectors roamed around southern England to ensure that the invasion assembly remained invisible to possible German surveillance planes. Thousands of tons of cinders and sludge oil were used to darken new road cuts so they wouldn't betray troop concentrations to any planes overhead. And garnished nets were used to cover tents and huts. The British alone used 1 million square yards of net. And even medical stretchers and surgical hampers were slathered with what was called toned-down paint. It's either standard camouflage color 1A, which is dark brown, or standard camouflage color 15, which is olive drab. Deception complemented the camouflage. The greatest prevarication of the war, originally known as Appendix Y, and eventually given the code name Fortitude, tried to induce the enemy to make faulty strategic dispositions of their troops. That was the order issued by the combined chiefs of staff in London and Washington. Try to make the enemy move to the wrong place. And there were 1,500 Allied deceivers who were using phony radio traffic to suggest that a fictional army with 8 divisions was gathering in Scotland to attack Norway in cahoots with the Soviets. Followed then by a larger invasion in mid-July of the Pas de Calais. It's 150 miles northeast of the actual invasion beaches in Normandy. And the Pas de Calais is the obvious place. It's the closest point between France and England. More than 200 big bobs. These are 8-ton decoy landing craft fashioned from canvas and oil drums, were conspicuously deployed beginning on May 20th around the Thames estuary, which would be the natural channel for an invasion heading to the Pas de Calais. Dummy radio transmitters now broadcast the radio hubbub, coded messages. You can't necessarily understand the message if you're the Germans, but you can understand that there's an enormous amount of radio traffic going on. And these dummy transmitters are kicking out the simulated radio traffic of a spectral 150,000-man U.S. 1st Army Group, notionally poised to pounce on the wrong coast in the wrong month. It doesn't exist. It's ostensibly commanded by George Patton. The British genius for duplicity, some of us talked about this yesterday, enhanced this series of ruses by passing information through more than a dozen German agents in England, all discovered, all arrested, and all flipped by British counterintelligence officers. And a network of British double agents with code names like Garbo and Tricycle, some of you are familiar particularly with Garbo, embellished this deception. And there were more than 500 deceitful radio messages, radio reports that were sent from London to enemy spy masters in Madrid and Lisbon for eventual relay to Berlin. The fortitude deception had, by the end of May, created a German hallucination. Enemy analysts now detected 79 Allied divisions staging in Britain. There were only 52. By late May, Allied intelligence, including Ultra, which is the British ability to intercept and decipher most coded German radio traffic, intelligence had discovered no evidence that the enemy has accurately assessed the area in which our main assault is to be made. This is the final report given to Eisenhower. He breathed a big sigh of relief and lit another cigarette. In a final pre-invasion fraud, Lieutenant Clifton James of the Royal Army Pay Corps, after spending time studying the many tics of General Bernard Montgomery, whom he strikingly resembled, flew to Gibraltar on May 26 and then to Algiers. He was fitted with a black beret, and he strutted around in public for several days in hopes that Berlin would conclude that no attack across the Channel was imminent if Monty was swanning around in the Mediterranean. Well, as May slid into June, these invasion preparations grew feverish. Every vehicle to be shoved onto the French coast required waterproofing to a depth of 54 inches. And they use a gooey compound of grease, lime, and asbestos fibers. And a vertical funnel, from the exhaust pipe sticks up. It's like a wren's tail sticking up in the back to prevent water from drowning the engine. A single Sherman tank took 300 man-hours to waterproof. It took the 5-man crew a week to waterproof their tank. Schaeff, on May 29th, also had ordered that 11,000 Allied airplanes to be used in the invasion display 3 broad white stripes on each wing, underside and topside, as recognition symbols. There had been terrible fratricide in Sicily, and they're trying to avoid this. So a frantic search begins at the end of May for 100,000 gallons of whitewash and 20,000 brushes. It required the mobilization of the British paint industry, and some air crews slathered on these white stripes with push brooms. Soldiers were issued seasickness pills, vomit bags, and life belts. These are incidentals that bring the average rifleman's combat load to 68.4 pounds. That's far beyond the 43 pounds that has been recommended for assault troops. They're heavily weighted down. Paratroops are carrying far more than that. And this will be an issue that we'll find when we're on the beaches. A company commander staging in Dorset with the 116th Infantry, which is bound for Omaha Beach, reported that his men were, as he put it, loping and braying about the camp under their packs, saying that as long as they were loaded like jackasses, they may as well sound like them. On June 2nd, 70 years ago today, the men donned what were called skunk suits. They're stiff, malodorous uniforms impregnated against poison gas. We wore them going into Iraq in March of 2003. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who's somebody I need no prompting to talk about, and we will talk about him a lot more. He's with the 4th Infantry Division. He wrote to his wife, whose name happened to be the same as the wife of his distant cousin, Franklin. Ted Roosevelt's wife's name was also Eleanor. So he writes to Eleanor on May 30th. We're ready now, as ready as we'll ever be. The blackbird says to his brother, if this be the last song ye shall sing, sing well, for you may not sing another. Each soldier placed his personal effects into a quartermaster box that was 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 4 inches deep for storage at a depot in Liverpool. It was like shedding an old skin or a previous life. And troops bound for France would fill 500 rail boxcars with these effects every week for the rest of the summer. Well, let's look at them one last time before we open it up to your questions. One last time as we send them off. With your indulgence, here's my description of the beginning of the invasion. And as we'll hear in Portsmouth tomorrow, Operation Overlord has been delayed 24 hours by a nasty storm that crops up in the English Channel. But then Eisenhower finally gives the launch order for the invasion. Across the fleet, the war cry sounded, "Up anchor!" In the murky, fretful dawn, from every English harbor and estuary spilled the great effluent of liberation, from Salcombe and Poole, Dartmouth and Weymouth, in tangled wakes from the Thames past the Black Deep and Whalebone marshes, all converging on the Whitecap Channel. Nearly 200,000 seamen and merchant mariners, crewing 59 convoys, carrying 130,000 soldiers, 2,000 tanks, and 12,000 vehicles. Ships heaved through the gray waves, cutters, corvettes, frigates, freighters, ferries, trawlers, tankers, sub-chasers. Ships for channel marking, for cable laying, for smoke making. Ships for refrigerating, towing, victualling. From the Irish Sea, the bombardment squadrons rounded Land's End in Cornwall. Pugnacious columns of cruisers, battleships, destroyers, even dreadnoughts given a second life, like the USS Nevada, raised and remade after Pearl Harbor. And the ancient monitor HMS Erebus, built to shell German fortifications in World War I with two 15-inch guns of dubious accuracy. And from her mast flew the signal Nelson had given: England expects every man to do his duty. And the heavy cruiser USS Tuscaloosa replied, "We are full of ginger." By mid-morning, the heavy skies lightened and the wind ebbed, recoloring the sea from pewter to sapphire. A luminous rainbow, said to be tropical in its colors, arced above the wet green English fields, and dappled sun lit the chalk cliffs of Kent like white curtains. A naval officer on the USS Quincy wrote, "War, I think, would tend to increase one's eye for beauty, just as it should tend to make peace more endurable." Sailors broke out their battle ensigns, stripped each bridge to fighting trim, and converted mess tables into operating theaters. In watertight compartments below decks, crewmen aboard the resurrected Nevada stowed dress blues, china, glassware, library books, tablecloths, office files, brooms, mirrors. Brigadier General Roosevelt again wrote his wife Eleanor from the USS Barnett, "We are starting on the great venture of this war. The men are crowded below or lounging on deck. Very few have seen action." Roosevelt, son of the 26th president, who at 56 would be the senior officer on Utah Beach in both age and rank in the first wave, he had seen enough in France during the last war and in the landings in Africa and on Sicily during this one to have premonitions. And he wrote to his wife, "We've had a grand life, and I hope there'll be more. Should it chance that there's not, at least we can say that in our years together we've packed enough for 10 ordinary lives. We've known joy, sorrow, triumph, and disaster, all that goes to fill the pattern of human existence. Our feet were placed in a large room, And we did not bury our talent in a napkin. The light faded and was gone. Deep into the English Channel, 59 darkened convoys went to battle stations as they pushed past parallel rows of dim navigation buoys, red to starboard, white to port like street lamps to France. Small crafts struggled in the wind and lop. A landing craft log recorded, waves washed over deck, stove went out, nothing to eat, explosives wet, could not be dried out. Short seas snapped tow ropes, flooded engine rooms, and slopped through troop compartments. Some helmsmen held their wheels 30 degrees off true to keep course. Several heaving vessels blinkered a one-word message: seasick, seasick, seasick. Down 10 channels, swept clean of mines, they plunged, 2 designated for each of the 5 forces streaming toward 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Wakes braided and rebraided, the amber orb of a full moon rose through a thinning overcast off the port bow. And the sea sang as swells slipped along every hull, bound for a better world. Hallelujah, sang the sea. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
If you have questions, please raise your hand.
There's one down here, Jeremy, I can see.
Here you go, sir.
What I'd like to know is that I've always heard of a story called The Man That Never Was. It was a ploy to fake the Germans using the body of a dead soldier dressed up as a messenger. Was that part of Fortitude, or was it part of the Italian invasion?
That is part of Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Some who were on bus 6 yesterday heard me talk about this because it involved a submarine, the Seraph, which had had many adventures during the war. And just in brief, because that is a mission that was launched to deceive the Germans about where the invasion after North Africa was going to come. Sicily was the obvious place. It's only 100 miles from Tunisia. It's a big aircraft carrying the Mediterranean. It's the next easy step toward southern Europe. And so the Brits, again, with this talent for deception, concocted a scheme in which they took a dead man, and only relatively recently have we learned who he was. It turned out he was a homeless man in London who had killed himself by drinking rat poison. And it turns out that rat poison, the physiological signs of rat poison are very similar to drowning. Foaming in the lungs look similar and so on. They found this guy. They'd been looking for a suitable candidate for a while. They dressed him in the uniform of a Marine major. They handcuffed to his wrist a briefcase full of phony documents, and the documents suggested that he was carrying important mail from London to British headquarters in Gibraltar, indicating that the next invasion after North Africa, and this is happening in the spring of 1943, will not be Sicily, but in fact will be the Greek Peloponnesus, southern Greece. The Seraph took this dead man, carried him by submarine from Britain off the coast of southern Spain, dumped him overboard in his uniform with his briefcase, dumped a life raft that had been shattered with shattered oars to make it look as though he was the victim of a plane crash, a plane traveling from Britain to Gibraltar. And they knew very well that the tides would carry him into the Spanish coast, and they knew very well that the Spanish would then turn the material over to the Germans. Worked beautifully. Spanish fishermen found the body, called Spanish authorities. They gave the body back to the British consulate in Spain, but not before they had picked the lock of the briefcase, copied the documents, and passed the documents along to the Germans in Madrid and thence to Berlin. And the Germans are looking at this saying, could it be southern Greece? It wasn't a decisive operation at all, but it did further confuse the Germans about where the next step would come.
I'm amazed that the Germans did not see all the preparation. How did we get lucky, beyond the nets and things that you've described, Rick? How did they miss the buildup in southern England? I get Calais and the possibility of that, but with so much material and so many people, seems to me they missed a big one. And I am curious as to why or how.
Well, they know there's a buildup going on, and they know that there are hundreds of thousands of American soldiers as well as Brits and Canadians and Norwegians or Poles that are gathering. They're not completely blind, but they're mostly blind. For one thing, they have zero aerial reconnaissance capability. Air domination has become so thorough on behalf of the Allies that the Germans cannot fly flights over England, Scotland, Northern Ireland to see what's going on. There are almost no flights that come over in the spring of 1944. It's worth your life if you're a German pilot to venture over the channel because we have such an impenetrable air cover that's been built. So that's one factor. Another factor is they have almost no naval reconnaissance. Rob mentioned the other day they don't really have a navy other than those U-boats, and so they've not been able to get out and at least look from the deck of a ship to see what's happening in southern England. So they know that something's coming. It's not that they don't expect an invasion, but we're talking 3,000 miles of coastline from Norway down to the French-Spanish border. And if you're trying to defend everywhere, you're defending nowhere. Now, they're not trying to defend everywhere, but they're putting their chips on certain things, and there's a big argument going on within the German high command over how best to counter the invasion when it comes. I'm sure Rob will talk more about that. But all in all, they are blind, they're deaf, and they're pretty dumb. And they just don't know where or when it's coming. And that is the essence of the deception that we are trying to foist on them. We don't pretend that we're not coming, but if you don't know where the punch is coming or when the punch is coming, you're largely defenseless. And they're, as we'll see, they're not entirely defenseless because there's very stout defenses along places like Normandy. But the ability to position the forces, particularly the armored forces that can react to something like an invasion when it's most vulnerable, which is in the first hours and days of the invasion, they're a bit at sea.
Rick, when was the demining of the English Channel undertaken, and how was that done without discovery?
Well, we'll talk more about it for sure when we get to Normandy. It's the largest mining operation, demining operation in the history of warfare. There are more than 300 minesweepers that are sent out. Now, the Germans have mined the English Channel. Don't worry, I think we've got most of them. And they have mined the Bay of the Seine, as well as other obvious potential invasion places. And so the mining operation is set up to avoid precisely what you suggest could happen, that they suddenly detect 300 minesweepers wandering around. The mining was done very quickly, basically starting just a couple of days before D-Day, and they swept channels. They didn't sweep the entire English Channel. They didn't sweep the entire Bay of the Seine, although eventually they did. But initially they're sweeping channels going from the gathering areas, and you'll see maps in those books that were set out, from the assembly areas where the ships are coming together off the southern coast of England for the most part, and a channel that heads toward France and the Bay of the Seine. And then as the invasion force is gathering, those minesweepers, and they have marked the channel with the lighted buoys that you can see. Again, the Germans don't have the ability to do reconnaissance. They cannot see these things. And we have lots of planes making sure that they aren't sending air reconnaissance, and they don't have the ability to send naval forces out. And then, so as the channel that's leading from England toward France is completed, then a very complex, sophisticated minesweeping operation begins really on the eve of the invasion in the Bay of the Seine. And you're sweeping the areas where the big warships are going to be steaming because they're going to be firing inland, and you're sweeping all the way into the beach areas, trying to ensure that there are no mines left. It's not complete. And as we will see, there are ships that hit mines, and there are men, quite a few men, who are killed. But all in all, you have to say it's a prodigious and successful operation.
I'll bring it up to you, sir. Bring the microphone.
General Roosevelt is buried in the American Cemetery in a very prominent grave. He died of a heart attack several days later, and it's very interesting. It's nice to see his grave there. It's very prominent. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, that's all the prompting I need to talk about Ted Roosevelt. He is the son of the 26th president, and he spends his entire life, 56 years, trying to live up to a father whose face is carved on Mount Rushmore. And he does pretty well. He's a runty little guy. He's got this deep foghorn voice. He's been in World War I, substantially wounded fighting with the 1st Division in France. He's been gassed and shot. He goes to Harvard. His father's convinced nothing will come of him because he doesn't seem to have much ambition. His first job is working in a carpet factory in Connecticut, I think, for $7 a week. Between the wars, he becomes the chairman of American Express, the governor general of Puerto Rico, the governor of the Philippines. He helps found the American Legion, or the Veteran of Foreign Wars, I can't remember which one. He's a prolific author. He's a great hunter. If you go to the Natural History Museum in Chicago, you will see that many of the trophies there are from Theodore Roosevelt Jr. And as war is approaching in 1940, he petitions to go back in. He's in his 50s at this point, and he walks with a cane. He is made a colonel. He eventually becomes a brigadier general. He becomes the assistant division commander of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. And he is in the first wave that lands in Algeria on November 8th, 1942. And he wins a Distinguished Service Cross for his heroics at El Ghoutar, pretty fierce battle in southern Tunisia. He is in the initial waves that land at Sicily, at Gela. He's instrumental in helping to repel the German counterattack in Sicily against the 1st Division. And then, toward the end of the Sicilian campaign, the 1st Infantry Division commander, his boss, Terry de la Mesa Allen, is relieved of command, and Roosevelt is relieved with him. Omar Bradley doesn't really like Allen, and if he's going to throw Allen over the side, he's going to throw his sidekick, Roosevelt, over the side. Part of this is because the 1st Division has become, particularly between the campaigns in Africa and Sicily, kind of an armed mob. And they're breaking into wine stores in Tunisia and so on. And Bradley, who's kind of a teetotaling, prim sodbuster, just really has it in for the 1st Division. It breaks Roosevelt's heart. I mean, he cries and cries about this. He thinks it's going to be the end of the war. He gets Eleanor, to whom he's writing many wonderful letters. His letters are in the Library of Congress. He gets Eleanor to petition George Marshall repeatedly, and she is really persistent, to give him a second chance. And Marshall finally relents to get her off his neck. He allows Roosevelt to come back in as a brigadier general assigned to the 4th Division. He lands, as we'll see, in the first wave at Utah Beach. He recognizes, and we'll talk more about it, that they are off by a mile, that currents have pushed them aside. And he gets them going from where they land. And you're absolutely right. It's a month later, in mid-July of 1944. He had his son Quentin is in the 1st Division, and he comes over to visit the old man. They're near Cherbourg at the time, and they spend an evening together, talking, reminiscing, talking about the family, gossiping, talking about the war, talking about this, talking about that. Quentin leaves about 10:30 to go back to his division, and Ted Roosevelt has a massive heart attack and dies. He never knows that he has been nominated for and will receive posthumously now the Medal of Honor for his heroics on Utah Beach. And yes, his grave, which will be in the cemetery where we are, is very, very moving.
Up to your left, Rick.
Yes, what about this vague notion that I have of these, I don't know whether paper mache decoy planes that are put at Calais, and this notion that Rommel was much smarter than Hitler, and he didn't bite for that decoy, but Hitler did. And I'd like for you to elaborate on that if you could.
Yeah, I talked about some of the decoys that they're using. They're not paper mache. They're made out of oil drums, and they're pretty elaborate, pretty sophisticated. The landing craft decoys weigh 8 tons apiece, and they're decoy tanks and they're decoy planes, and all of that. It's largely for naught because the Germans don't have the aerial capacity to send reconnaissance flights over to take pictures of these things. So there's really no evidence that the German high command, whether it's Rommel or anybody else, has been told, hey, look at these big bobs, these landing craft that are in the Thames estuary. There is a very large argument going on within the German high command, and Rob will talk about it surely at greater length than I will and more coherently. But essentially the Germans are having a debate over what to do and how to defend against this invasion they know is coming. And Rommel, who has faced Allied air power in spades in North Africa and seen some of it in Italy, and has been, as of January 1944, assigned by Hitler, he's the most magnetic German general, certainly in the Western Front, to take charge of the army group that happens to have its, in its sector, Normandy. And he really throws himself into the job in earnest, and he's planting mines and putting all kinds of obstacles out. And he believes that because of Allied air superiority, that it will be very difficult to move the panzer reinforcements. This is the heart of the German counterattacking force, any distance, because Allied planes will be on them instantly and make life hell. Others, including Rundstedt, who is Rommel's boss, he's the theater commander in the West, believe that you cannot put your limited armored reinforcements too close to any one beach, because what happens if you pick the wrong beach? It'll be even harder to move them laterally along the beaches as you need to. So they argue that a better solution is to have a kind of a central repository not far from Paris, and that's where the bulk of the German armor reinforcements, these mechanized mobile reinforcements, will be. Well, Hitler listens to these arguments, and they thrash it out pretty thoroughly through the spring of 1944, and Hitler kind of cuts the baby in half. He gives Rommel some of the force to place where he wants. He has the rest of it basically in a central area, but he keeps personal control over a good portion of it. So nobody's happy. Nobody's convinced that they've found the solution to it, but that's the way it is as of June 6, 1944. I don't think you can say that Rommel was necessarily smarter than Rundstedt or Hitler about this. He is quite right that moving any distance against this terrifying onslaught of 11,000 planes overhead is hell. And when those divisions begin to move, and we'll talk a lot more about it, they are against a very stiff force in the Allied planes that are attacking them relentlessly as they move toward the invasion beaches. So, we'll talk about it more, and Rob will give you greater detail on the German thinking about this.
Up to your right, Rick.
We'll get back to you, sir.
Rick, in the pre-invasion training, wasn't there a disaster at Slapton Sands that perhaps you could talk about?
Yeah, there was a disaster at Slapton Sands, and perhaps we'll hear more about it at Portsmouth tomorrow, but in general, what happens is this. There are rehearsals going on before Normandy, and there's a series of exercises. And the exercises are designed to get all of the players accustomed to working together. That includes Coast Guardsmen, Navy officers, swabs, soldiers, getting them accustomed to getting onto the landing craft, getting them accustomed to being at sea, getting them accustomed to listening to orders of when to get into the Higgins boats to go ashore. One of the exercises takes place on the southern coast of England, a remote area that the British have very generously vacated for us as a training area called Slapton Sands. And it's in April. Now, I said that the Germans had no substantial naval force. It didn't mean they had no naval force. They still had submarines, but they also had a kind of patrol boat, these small, fast boats that they were sending out into the channel periodically. The exercise at Slapton Sands was to take a unit in a convoy and to steam around a bit to simulate going to Normandy. The soldiers didn't know that. The topography at Slapton Sands is quite similar to some of the beaches, particularly Utah Beach in Normandy. And what happened was that there was a miscommunication, really a fatal miscommunication over security for this convoy. The Brits were supposed to provide most of the security with the Royal Navy, and by chance, 3, I believe it was, German patrol boats, heavily armed, managed to get through the security screen and attack the convoy and torpedoed several LSTs. There had been a hope by a lot of soldiers that the LST had a shallow enough draft that torpedoes would go under the hull of the ship. No. And there were hundreds of American soldiers, particularly some sailors, who died. Now, and it was terrible. It was awful. Eisenhower felt awful, not least for the loss of the LSTs. He is counting personally LSTs. It is the critical thing that he needs, and to have LSTs go to the bottom at Slapton Sands breaks his heart almost as much as the loss of these soldiers. There are bodies washing ashore on the southern coast of England for days and weeks, and one of the things that causes the most anxiety, and these bodies are being hauled inland, and it's just a terrible few days. One of the things that causes the greatest anxiety is that among the missing are, I can't remember, it's a dozen or so officers who are bigoted. Bigot is the compartmented code word that means you are permitted to have security clearance to know where and when the invasion is going to take place. It's really the highest clearance for those in the know about Overlord. And there are a dozen guys who are bigoted who are missing. And there's concern that perhaps they've been captured. Where are they? And there is great concern, as you can imagine, that somebody could spill the beans. Oh yeah, there's a big invasion coming. By the way, it's in Normandy, and it's set for June 5th. Well, they eventually recover all the bodies of the bigoted officers, and that's one less anxiety in that long pinwheel list for Eisenhower to worry about.
Be right down to you, sir.
He's coming.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Question about the 8th Air Force. How did the 8th Air Force integrate into the preparation for Overlord?
Yeah, let me step all over Don by answering that at great length. And I am going to let Don answer that because he's the expert on the 8th Air Force, and he can answer that much more coherently than I can. But obviously, there are a lot of moving parts, naval, air, ground. And the 8th Air Force has a number of duties and responsibilities. They have been flying strategic missions. Don talked about it yesterday at some length. And the argument is going back and forth on what should be their contribution to the invasion. Now, there are some in the 8th Air Force who want to just keep hitting those strategic targets that are far from the invasion beaches. And, not surprisingly, there are those responsible for putting those troops onto the beaches who want every bit of firepower they can get devoted to that task. Their argument, in essence, is, look, if we fail on June 6th, as it turns out, then it doesn't matter what you're doing in dropping more bombs on Hamburg or Dortmund or wherever. This is something that Eisenhower has to reconcile. And so their contribution will be substantial, but ultimately not particularly successful in hitting tactical targets. Now, they have been asked, and it's not just the 8th Air Force, it's basically all the heavy forces, to hit areas right along the beaches just before the invasion comes. Don will tell you what happens. They don't really hit what they're supposed to hit, partly because of bad weather, partly because of anxiety about bombing friendly troops, and partly just because of the fog of war. So they are a player when it comes to the invasion. But as we will see, and we'll talk about this a lot more when we get there, they have not softened up the landing areas as robustly as had been hoped.
I'll get to you as quickly as I can, sir.
Thank you. Rick, if you could briefly speak on what value, if any, there was that was developed by Frederick Morgan and Cossack before Schaeff got on board. Did they have to scrap everything Cossack came up with, or?
Yeah, what a great question. I'm glad you brought him up, because I gave him short shrift. As they've been thinking about invading the continent really since early 1942. The first big and most important strategic decision that has been made at the highest level by Churchill and Roosevelt is Germany first. The presumption is that if you defeat the strongest of the Axis powers, the lesser powers, meaning Italy and Japan, will fall from the tree like rotten fruit. This is sensible, it's even wise, it's correct. So the intent is to take the war to the Germans before the others. Now, for all kinds of reasons, it doesn't play out quite that way. Partly the Navy and the Marine Corps, all 6 Marine divisions are in the Pacific, and they have a lot to do out there, and they're really pressing their war. But Germany first is the premise. By the way, I see General Boomer here. Eisenhower pleaded to get Marines in the European theater. He really wanted Marine units. He got none. So they've been thinking about how to get onto the occupied continent of Europe since early 1942. After there is a general agreement that there will be an invasion and that it will ultimately occur in the spring of 1944, a structure is set up to begin planning it. And it's given the acronym COSAC, Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander. Well, there is no Supreme Allied Commander yet. He's the Chief of Staff to nobody because Eisenhower isn't going to be appointed to the job until late in 1943. But in the meantime, there is a staff set up to begin working some of these very problems we've been talking about. And the Chief of Staff is a British general named Frederick Morgan. Morgan is told the rough parameters, and it's Morgan and his staff, incidentally, who choose Normandy early. They kind of put their finger on a map and they say, here are the reasons why this should be the place and not there or there or there. Morgan is given certain parameters. Okay, you got X number of divisions likely, you got Y number of LSTs likely. Come up with a plan. Morgan proposes landing on 3 beaches. And it's essentially the plan that ultimately is enacted as part of Overlord, but when the big shots from the Mediterranean, incidentally, they call themselves the Mediterraneanites because they've all been through the war together, and it includes Eisenhower, Montgomery, Patton, Bradley. It's a very long list. They are really fused together by this Mediterranean experience. If you're not a Mediterraneanite, and Morgan is not, you're kind of on the outs. You're not with the in crowd. It's a problem, as we will see later in the war. But they come back. Eisenhower's been appointed Supreme Commander. Montgomery has been appointed essentially the ground commander for Overlord. And they're looking at the plan, at the map, and they say it's too small. It's insufficient. Instead of 3 beaches on a 25-mile front, we want 5 beaches on a 50-mile front. That's one of the main reasons it's delayed from May till June. Because as you expand to those 2 other beaches, and everyone finally agrees, yeah, okay, we got it. It's got to be bigger. Got to be 5 beaches. We like a lot of the rest of the plan. We're going to incorporate it in. A lot of the thinking about everything from minesweeping to deception. Morgan's guys have been working on that. He is a big contributor to the success of Overlord. But when you expand substantially this plan, it requires you to have more of everything. So if you've added Utah Beach. That means not only do you need the 4th Infantry Division to hit that beach, you need the LSTs and the rest of the naval force to transport those troops and all of the support that's required for that. The same thing on the other end. If you're going to add Sword Beach on the flip side of the invasion beach. So, Morgan, he's no dummy. If they had said, okay, we've got enough stuff for you to create 5 beaches, he would have created 5 beaches. He offers a plan with 3 beaches because he is told that is the limit of the resources available.
Great. Well, thank you all for the rich questions. Rick, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation again. It is...
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Please enjoy your next hour and a half. And for those of you on the military tour, please come back here at 1:15 in the show lounge and at 1:45 for the cultural tour in the main bar. Thank you.